Haste is a keyword ability that makes it so a creature can ignore summoning sickness, allowing them to attack or activate tapped abilities the turn they enter the battlefield. Red is by far the color most heavily associated with this ability, as it goes great with the color's chaotic and aggressive identity. However, there are other colors who get the ability occasionally, and even some colorless creatures with haste. So today, we're going to go over the best creatures with haste in the game who aren't red. And starting us off at number 10, we have Mistcutter Hydra. This is a 0/0 Hydra with a mana cost of X and 1 green. It has the abilities where it can't be countered, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. It has haste and protection from blue, meaning it can't be targeted, damaged, blocked by, or enchanted, or equipped with anything that's blue. This is a card that's mostly seen playing sideboards, as it's amazing against blue decks exactly, and not really worth playing against most other decks. However, Mistcutter has come down and ruined a lot of blue mages' days. The inability for blue interactions to work on the card at all is particularly potent, since blue is one of the most interactive colors in Magic. Blue decks rely heavily on counter magic and bounce spells to stop your opponent from developing their board long enough for the powerful card draw to take over. This would make it an important sideboard piece in just about any format, but it was even better in this particular standard. There was a very powerful mono blue deck, Devotion to Blue, in the format, built around abusing the powerful Master of Waves. This deck had basically no way to out Mistcutter, making it almost an auto-win button. In more recent years, Mistcutter has seen play in certain sideboards of Devotion to Green decks in Pioneer. These are decks built around the powerful Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. This is a land that lets you pay 2 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color for each mana symbol amongst permanents you control of that color. By playing a lot of cards with a large number of green mana symbols in them, the deck can make a ton of mana off of their Nykthos. Mistcutter is a great place to spend all that mana thanks to not being able to be countered and having haste, letting it come down and end the game quickly. Mistcutter isn't the best top-end threat against every deck, but against blue decks specifically, it's possibly the best threat in the format. And at number 9, we have Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider. This is a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Praetor creature with a mana cost of 4 and 2 green. It has haste and trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to defending player. It has the abilities where, if you put counters on a permanent or a player, you put twice that many counters on that permanent or player instead. And if an opponent would put counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many counters on that permanent or player rounded down instead. This is basically the same effect as the commander's staple, Doubling Season, combined with the reverse effect, namely having your opponent's counters. This ability is incredibly powerful, specifically when combined with Planeswalkers. You see, the loyalty of Planeswalkers are technically a type of counter, so with Vorinclex out, they'll come down with twice as much loyalty. This is especially important because most Planeswalkers have an ultimate ability that costs a lot of loyalty and has a huge impact on the game. This means you can use cards like Red and 7 to pick up your entire graveyard the first turn you play them, or even better Planeswalkers ultimates like Tameo, Field Researcher, who draws you 3 cards and gives you an emblem that lets you cast spells without paying their mana cost for the rest of the game. Stopping all of your opponent's counters from working was good in some scenarios, but it didn't come up all that often. Now, all of this was very powerful, but in competitive, this wasn't the biggest reason that Vorinclex saw play. The main reason was that it was a 6/6 body with haste and trample for 6 mana, which is just a very powerful threat for the mana cost. Putting out 6 damage out of nowhere that can't be chump blocked is a really great way to end a game. This card was mostly used in various mid-range decks back in its standard format, where the deck would try and control the board as effectively as they could, either by playing removal or playing better creatures than their opponent. In this kind of deck, Vorinclex worked well as a curve topper. With a combination of removal and good threats, you're likely to both make it to turn 6 where you can cast the card and have done some damage to your opponent, so the haste threat becomes more relevant. On top of the sudden damage, if you ever drew Vorinclex in your Red and 7 at the same time, and your opponent didn't have an answer to it, you basically just won the game. Vorinclex hasn't broken into many other formats, but it saw enough play in its standard to make its way onto this list anyway. And at number 8, we have Rankle, Master of Pranks. This is a legendary 3/3 fairy rogue creature with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has haste and flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. It has the ability where, whenever it attacks, you choose any number of the following. You can make each player discard a card, or make each player draw a card and lose 1 life, or make each player sacrifice a creature. Rankle might not have the most imposing stat line ever, as a 3/3 with flying and haste for 4 mana is only acceptable as opposed to good. However, its powerful and versatile attack trigger allows it to have a huge impact on the game despite it not being the largest threat around. While all the modes are symmetrical, being able to pick and choose the best mode for a given situation means that you'll always get far more value from it than your opponent. The mode to make each player discard a card combines well with the ability to make players draw cards, especially given the order in which they're printed. You see, the modal effects that let you choose multiple modes when they resolve, the order the effects happen follows the order they're printed on the card. So in the case of Rankle, if you choose all 3 modes, each player will discard a card, then each player will draw a card and lose a life. Then sacrifice a creature. This is important because you don't have to discard a card to draw a card off of Rankle. So if you're empty-handed, you can choose the modes to make each player discard and draw, forcing your opponent to discard and then draw a new card, but only get to draw a card yourself. The sacrifice mode can also be very powerful. If you combine it with cards like Woe Strider, which produces creature tokens, you can get rid of an entire card from your opponent while only having to get rid of a token yourself. Alternatively, you could use it to sacrifice your own creatures with death triggers, such as a Shambling Ghast, getting an additional upside on top of removing a potential blocker. And of course, you can just use the ability whenever your worst creature isn't as good as your opponent's worst creature, which is very powerful on a card with multiple other upsides. Rankle mostly saw play in Standard as well, where it was used by a variety of black aggro decks. And at number 7, we have Gingerbrute. This is a 1/1 food golem artifact creature with a mana cost of 1. It has haste and the abilities where you can pay 1 to make it so that it can't be blocked except by creatures with haste until the end of the turn. And you can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. Besides the ability it shares with all food, Brute has a very unique form of evasion. This is really the only card in the game that turns haste into a defensive ability, and it has a very unique origin. The set Gingerbrute was printed in, Eladrin, was based off of fairy tales. Gingerbrute is based off the old gingerbread man nursery rhyme, run as fast as you can, and all that. While the origin of this ability may be interesting, in gameplay it's surprisingly powerful. It's very difficult to block Gingerbrute, as haste isn't the most common ability around, and most creatures with haste are going to be spending most of the time attacking anyway. This means you can fairly consistently get your Brute in for damage, though since it's only a 1/1, this alone won't do too much. This is where various methods of pumping up your Brute come in. Back in Standard, this was done with All That Glitters. This is an aura for 1/1 white that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. This suffers from a lot of the same issues that plague most auras, namely that they get completely blown out by a single removal spell. However, this flaw is severely lessened by Gingerbrute's haste and evasion, meaning you can get a huge amount of damage on your opponent in a single turn for just 4 mana with both cards in your hand. By playing both of these cards alongside a lot of cheap artifacts and enchantments, such as Accolades of Life Bounty and Stonecoil Serpent, you can quickly hit your opponent for scary amounts of damage as soon as they give you an opportunity. Outside of Standard, the card is also used in some variants of Hammer Time decks. This deck basically tries to cheat Colossus Hammer into creatures with Sigard as aid, giving them a massive +10/+10. Gingerbrute's powerful form of evasion makes it a great target for the hammer, especially since it's not at all hurt to buy the loses flying claws of Hammer. Brute will likely continue to see play in various artifact-focused decks in the future, especially since they tend to be fairly aggressive in the first place. And at number 6, we have Strangleroost Geist. This is a 2/1 spirit with a mana cost of 2 green. It has haste and Undying, meaning that whenever it dies, if you don't have a +1/+1 counter on it, you return to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Geist is just a really good threat for its cost. A 2-power creature with haste is fine for 2 mana, and Undying is more than enough to take the card from good to great. You never really want to use a removal spell or trade with Geist with no counters on it, because you'll only be making the situation worse. This led to the card seeing quite a bit of play in mono green aggro decks in Standard. Nowadays, however, the card is probably more known for wreaking havoc in Modern thanks entirely to its Undying ability. You see, there's a card called Yawgmoth Thran Physician that works very well with Undying. Yawgmoth has the ability where you can pay 1 life and sacrifice a creature to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card. Now, there's a specific interaction between +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters, where if a creature has a number of both of them, you simply remove both types of counters to balance them out. So if a creature like Geist triggers its Undying and comes back, Yawgmoth can put a -1/-1 counter on it to effectively take the +1/+1 counter away. If you have 2 Undying creatures, you can alternate between sacrificing each of them and putting the counter on the other to effectively pay 1 life to draw a card. This has become the backbone of a deck in Modern, and Geist is one of the best Undying threats the deck can play. The card has also seen a bit of play in mono green decks in the format, but those decks haven't been viable for a while. Still, the fact that it was able to compete in Modern, even if it was quite a while ago, shows that this is far more than just the average best 2-drop in Standard. And at number 5, we have Craterhoof Behemoth. This is a 5/5 beast with a mana cost of 5 and 3 green. It has haste and the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +X/+X and gain trample until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is a great way to end the game if you have a good number of creatures on board, unless your opponent has an answer to the hoof that stops it from entering the field and getting the trigger. The pump it gives the rest of your board will usually be enough to end the game anyway. The card has seen play in all kinds of decks ever since it was printed. Back in Standard, it was used in Unburial Rites decks as one of the deck's win conditions. After rotating out of Standard, it found two main homes. The most important one is in Legacy, where it's often used to win the game after casting a Natural Order. This is a sorcery that costs 4 mana that lets you sacrifice a green creature to go find a green creature in your deck and put it directly into the battlefield. This is used to find various creatures, and Craterhoof is usually used as a way to end the game. Outside of competitive formats, Craterhoof is also very popular in Commander. It's possibly even better in the format due to how large boards tend to get. Hoof will often be giving your board +10/+10 or more, enough to completely overwhelm the entire table. This has led to Craterhoof becoming the de facto best win condition for green decks in the format. Craterhoof has been used in far too many decks to mention here, and will continue to only add to its legacy as time goes on. And at number 4, we have Vengevine, though Bloodghast and Ichorid deserve a mention here as well. Vengevine is a 4/3 elemental with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green. It has haste and the ability where, whenever you cast your second creature spell for a turn, you return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. The main way this card is seen play is in various graveyard-focused decks, mostly built around it specifically. A 4/3 body with haste is good enough that if you can build your deck to consistently get Vengevine out early with its ability, it's good enough to win games in formats like Modern. By combining Vengevine with creatures like Stitcher's Supplier, which is a 1/1 for 1 that mills 3 cards from your deck when it enters the battlefield or dies, and Lotleth Troll, which lets you discard a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. With all of these cards, and even more we don't have time to mention, it's very easy to fill your graveyard with cards like Vengevine. Of course, there are far more threats that come back from the graveyard, so you don't have to rely only on Vengevine alone. That's where Bloodghast and Ichorid come in, alongside a ton of other threats that have been paired with Vine in different decks. Bloodghast is a 2/1 for 2 black with the ability where, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. It can't block, and if your opponent has 10 or less life, it has haste. Ichorid is a 3/1 for 3 and 1 black with haste. At the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice Ichorid, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile a black creature card from your graveyard to return it from the graveyard to the field. All 3 of these cards would have made onto this list by themselves, but because they're all so similar in how they're used, it makes a lot more sense to put them all at the same spot instead. Ever since Ichorid first came out in Torment, the strategy of milling yourself aggressively and just flinging creatures out of your graveyard to your opponent has been around. Vengevine is the most prolific card of this kind, seeing the most competitive success, but each of these cards and several more have had their chance in the sun. And at number 3, we have Reality Smasher. This is a 5/5 Eldrazi with a mana cost of 4 and 1 colorless. This is a very specific type of mana only produced by specific mana sources, such as Waste. It has Trample and Haste and the ability where, whenever it becomes a target of a spell or an opponent's card, you counter it unless they discard a card. This is another rather run-of-the-mill strong threat with haste. It can deal a lot of damage in a hurry, and it has a strong protection effect that forces your opponent to 2-for-1 themselves in order to deal with it, which allowed the card to see a decent amount of play back in its Standard. Of course, any longtime player will recognize this as one of the period of time known as Eldrazi Winter. This was a span of time where Eldrazi tribal decks were far and away the best deck in the format, to the point where nothing else could really compete. While there were powerful Eldrazi around, the real reason the deck was so good were the lands. Eldrazi Temple could be tapped for a colorless or tapped for 2 colorless, but only spent on Eldrazi spells. Eye of Ugin is a legendary land that makes all of your colorless spells cost 2 less to cast, and lets you pay 7 mana and tap it to search your library for a colorless creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Basically, you had 8 lands that gave you 2 mana for all of your Eldrazi. When you combine this with a series of rather powerful creatures, you get a deck that's way better than anything else in the format. This deck saw play all the way back to Vintage, the most powerful format in all of Magic. It was so powerful that Eye of Ugin had to be banned in order to stop the Eldritch Tentacle Rampage from ravaging the format. The deck has still seen play here and there using just Eldrazi Temple, but the ban did a good enough job of stopping it from being truly broken. Reality Smasher was just one of the best Eldrazi to be casting, so its legacy seen play comes mostly from its creature type rather than what the card itself does. And at number 2, we have Kaldra Compleat. This is legendary equipment with a mana cost of 7. It has Living Weapon, meaning that whenever it enters the battlefield, you make a 0/0 black Phyrexian Germ creature token and attach the equipment to it. It has Indestructible, meaning it can't be destroyed by damage or destroy effects. It has an equip cost of 7, and it has the ability where the equipped creature gets +5/+5, and has Haste, Indestructible, Trample, and First Strike, meaning it deals combat damage before creatures without First Strike, and the ability where whenever it deals combat damage to a creature, you exile that creature. It's worth mentioning that Kaldra Compleat maybe shouldn't be on this list, as it's a list of cards that natively have haste, not cards that give haste to other creatures. However, since Kaldra is a living weapon and therefore basically a creature by itself, it slid onto this list anyway. Now, you can't talk about Kaldra Compleat without talking about its partner in crime, Stoneforge Mystic. This is a 1/2 core artificer for 2 mana. When it enters a battlefield, it tutors out an equipment, and you can pay 1/1 white to tap it to put an equipment from your hand onto the battlefield. So with Mystic, you can find Kaldra Compleat, and then your next turn you can pay 2 mana and tap it to cheat your Kaldra out on turn 3. This is basically unbeatable, as Kaldra is a huge threat that beats almost any creature outright in combat, thanks to its powerful combat damage triggers that requires very specific removal to answer. On top of this, Mystic can find a number of other powerful equipment. For example, Shadow Spear is a versatile equipment that can help you push through damage, recover life, and remove hexproof and indestructible from your opponent's threats. Basically, Stoneforge could tutor for whatever you wanted. And if what you wanted was a giant threat to end the game, the best answer right now is Kaldra Compleat. The only reason why Kaldra Compleat isn't at the number 1 spot on this list is that it's a Modern Horizon card, so it was never legal in Standard. And at number 1, we have Questing Beast. This is a 4/4 legendary beast creature token with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green. It has haste, death touch, meaning any amount of damage it deals to a creature is enough to destroy it, and vigilance, meaning it doesn't have to tap to attack. It has the abilities where Questing Beast can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage dealt by creatures you control can be prevented, and whenever Questing Beast deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. Questing Beast is a creature with a huge number of upsides. It's difficult to block, always at least trades, and has a very unique ability that makes it great against planeswalkers. Being able to deal damage to your opponent and a planeswalker at the same time gets rid of a massive upside of planeswalkers that's often overlooked, which is the phantom life they give you by soaking up hits from your opponent. There's not really an additional layer here as to why the card is good. It's just an amazing threat. There are at least a few interesting folds to the card. For one, protection stopping damage from being dealt to a creature is technically a damage prevention ability. This can lead to some interesting interactions, where if True Name Nemesis blocks a Questing Beast, it will still die. Beast saw a massive amount of play in its standard format and has broken into Pioneer, seen a bit of play in Modern here and there, and seen very sparing play in Legacy. In Pioneer, it sees play in a variety of aggro decks, and in Modern, it sees play in Cascade decks. These decks are built around using Cascade spells to hit the same cards every time, so they can't play cards that cost less than 3 mana. Questing Beast is playing the sideboard of certain builds to help out in a few specific matchups. The main reason Questing Beast is so high is just the amount of play the card has seen. Not only did it do a ton in Standard, but if you want a green curve topper in Pioneer or Modern, Questing Beast is usually your best bet. While it's not inarguable, Questing Beast is at least the most heavily played creature with haste in the game, and it's hard to not extrapolate that into the most powerful. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.